Well, let's get more perspective now on bail reform in the U.S. I'm joined in studio by Shon Hopwood, Associate Professor at Georgetown Law. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So for people who are unfamiliar with the U.S. system, you have bail and you have bond. Talk about how these work and the pros and cons of each.
Yeah, so when someone is charged with a crime, they are remanded to the court to either be put in custody or to be allowed pretrial release prior to their trial or guilty plea. And many jurisdictions, including New York, used cash bail for people to be released. In other words, the judge would set a certain amount of money they would have to pay, the defendant would pay that money, and then they would be released pre-trial.
And then what about bonds? Because we know there's also bail bondsmen. A lot of people get that confused.
Well, bonds are just where you have to go to a private bail bondsman to set your bond so that you can be released. In most cases, because someone doesn't have the funds or the resources to pay for the bail themselves.
So what's your take on some of the key points in this New York law and some of the changes that are already being considered, especially since now there's backlash?
Well, New York's not the only one. States across the country have realized that cash bail is fundamentally unfair in that people who have means are able to bond out or bail out and do not have to serve time in a county jail pending their trial or guilty plea. But people that were poor and don't have the means would be stuck in county jail, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, awaiting trial, even though they have not been convicted of an offense. And so most states have recognized that that was a way for wealthy defendants to be released and poor defendants to remain in jail.
So then for those who have pending cases, what does this new legislation mean for them?
Well, for people that have pending cases and that have nonviolent offenses that they're being charged with or misdemeanors, this allows them pretrial release. You know, in the United States, there is the presumption of innocence, and just because someone has been charged with a crime doesn't necessarily mean they committed that crime. And the belief is that, you know, for people who have committed nonviolent or misdemeanor offenses, we shouldn't be incarcerating them pending the outcome of what actually happens with their charges.
So then what are some alternatives then? What can really be done to sort of level the playing field so that regardless of the amount of money that you have, you get the same opportunity, though, without putting the public in jeopardy?
Yeah, well, I think most jurisdictions have determined about whether or not the defendant is at risk of reoffending, whether they're a danger to society, and then the other thing is a flight risk, whether or not they will actually show up back to their court proceedings. Now, there's been a bunch of empirical data that say that if you let people out, they will actually show up to court hearings at almost the same rate as people who are confined. And so most jurisdictions have realized that maybe we can get away from the cash bail system.
Now, a lot of this came about because it felt that it was unfairly targeting the poor. So how does this new law affect that perception?
Well, because people that are poor will no longer have to pay to get out of pretrial custody. If they can show that they have either committed a nonviolent offense or they're being charged with a misdemeanor, they will be released almost automatically unless the judge finds that they are some danger to society. And the groups that have studied this have found that people who are actually released pre-trial commit new crimes at a lower rate than people who are actually confined pre-trial and then convicted and sentenced.
Now, we know that obviously bail bonding is in itself a business. What sort of money are we actually talking about for that industry?
I don't know I don't know exactly how much money is involved in the industry, but bail bondsmen in states across the country that have been jurisdictions that are getting rid of cash bail, they're fighting this because it is their livelihood, and without it, they just will cease to exist.
And what would you say have been the biggest criticisms of this reform bill, this bail reform bill?
Mostly from people that don't understand it. I've seen lots of news articles in the last few days saying that this is going to release dangerous, violent criminals on the streets, people who've been convicted or charged with violent felonies, but this bill doesn't do anything for them. Those offenses will still be treated the same as they were under the prior law. This really only impacts people who are charged with nonviolent and misdemeanor offenses.
And just quickly, we have about 20 seconds. Are there any other major criminal reforms that you see perhaps coming down the pipeline in 2020 that we should pay attention to?
I think sentencing reform will be on the agenda both on the federal side and in many states. The United States and citizens have finally realized that sentencing people for long periods of time doesn't make us safer, and it's actually counterproductive if the goal is to make it a more effective criminal justice system.
All right, thank you so much. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
Shon Hopwood there, Associate Professor at Georgetown Law.